What if the South had won the Civil War? The morning fog clung to the Pennsylvania hills like a death shroud, veiling the blood-drenched fields of Gettysburg in an eerie stillness. Crows circled overhead, scavenging among shattered bodies. But within the command tent of General Robert E. Lee, there was no stillness, only a brewing storm of decision. Outside, the Army of Northern Virginia waited, wind-battered and bloodied, their fate hanging on one final gamble. This was not the Gettysburg of our history books. Lee had changed his plan. After heated debates and desperate prayers, he rejected Pickett's ill-fated frontal assault. Instead, he ordered Longstreet's corps to strike wide around the Union left, flanking Little Round Top with silent urgency under the cloak of twilight. While Union General Meade anticipated another brutal charge at the center, the Confederate maneuver caught them unprepared. The hills fell not with a bang, but with a series of deadly whispers, bayonets in the dark, musket shots muffled by trees, and Union cries that faded into pine and blood. By dawn, July 4th, 1863, the Union line had broken. Washington, just 90 miles away, buzzed with panic. President Lincoln, already worn by grief and exhaustion, faced the unthinkable. Lee's army was advancing southward again, victorious, confident, and capable. A string of Confederate victories from Fredericksburg to Chancellorsville had already demoralized the North, but Gettysburg, had it been won, was supposed to be the war's turning point for the Union. Instead, it became the North's unraveling. The British and French watched with quiet astonishment. Dispatches from diplomats in Richmond arrived in London and Paris with startling clarity. The Confederacy had won a major victory on Northern soil, and Washington was in a panic. Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, reconsidered his prior hesitations. Napoleon III, eager to counterbalance Union strength in the Americas, leaned in. Recognizing the Confederate States of America was no longer unthinkable. For the soldiers who fought that day, the cost was personal, immediate, and brutal. Corporal Elijah Monroe, a farmer from Tennessee, watched as his best friend bled out beside him beneath the shadow of Devil's Den. He didn't fight for slavery, he'd told himself, but for Tennessee, for honor, for home. And now, with Gettysburg in Confederate hands, he believed the war was finally turning their way. But what came next was not peace. General Lee knew his army was exhausted, stretched too thin to take Washington. Instead, he used his victory to retreat in strength back to Virginia, leaving the Union reeling. Newspapers in New York and Boston printed editorials screaming betrayal and incompetence. Lincoln's administration teetered on collapse. The Copperheads, the anti-war Democrats, gained traction in the North, calling for an immediate negotiated peace. Then came the draft riots in New York City. In July, just days after Lee's retreat, mobs of poor white laborers, angry at conscription and terrified of freed slaves taking their jobs, burned parts of Manhattan. Black citizens were lynched in the streets. Federal troops had to be recalled from the front to quell the chaos. The message was clear. The North was not just losing the war, it was tearing itself apart. In Richmond, Confederate President Jefferson Davis read the Northern newspapers with quiet satisfaction. But he knew victory was not yet certain. The Confederacy remained fractured economically, dependent on cotton and increasingly isolated. But now, with momentum on their side and foreign powers reconsidering their stance, a political opportunity emerged, one that Davis would seize with the cunning of a statesman forged in fire. He dispatched envoys to Britain and France, bearing news of the victory and bearing gifts, promises of Southern cotton, trade deals, and assurances of a stable new nation. Britain, facing textile shortages due to the Union blockade, was tempted. France, eager for a counterweight to American expansionism in the hemisphere, was intrigued. Though recognition would not come immediately, the Confederacy's path toward legitimacy had opened. In the North, Lincoln faced an existential crisis. His Emancipation Proclamation, issued just months earlier, now looked hollow without victory to back it. The Republican Party fractured under pressure from within. His generals bickered, morale fell, and 1864 loomed like a storm on the horizon. Union resolve was cracking, not just on the battlefield, but in the soul of the Republic itself, and through it all, the South began to dream, not just of survival, but of triumph. Cotton barons toasted in Charleston. Richmond's warhawks began to sketch maps of a greater South. Texas reclaimed from Western settlers. Mexico pushed back. Perhaps even Cuba and the Caribbean in Confederate hands. The dream of a Southern empire, rooted in slavery and sovereignty, felt closer than ever. But the cost of victory was steep. Fields lay fallow, plantations burned, thousands of Confederate widows wandered ruined towns, and yet hope burned amid the ashes. Because Gettysburg had not been a defeat, it had been a second birth for the Confederacy, and that was only the beginning of the storm. Autumn came early to Washington in 1863. The Potomac shimmered beneath gray skies, its waters swollen with September rains. And tension. Inside the White House, Abraham Lincoln paced like a man staring at his own funeral procession. The mood among his cabinet was dire. The Union had not only lost Gettysburg, but its grip on the war's moral high ground. Public opinion was fracturing faster than he could mend it. Lincoln was never more alone. Across the table from him sat Secretary of State William Seward, face drawn, voice low. "If we don't negotiate now," he warned, "we may not have a Union left to preserve." But Lincoln refused to concede. "To recognize the South," he said flatly, "is to recognize slavery. That will not be my legacy." Still, the pressure was immense. Northern newspapers began printing leaked letters from congressmen advocating for a peace commission. Wall Street faltered. Anti-war rallies swelled in major cities, and in Ohio, the controversial former Congressman Clement Villan Andegam returned from exile in Canada to launch a renewed Copperhead campaign calling for immediate ceasefire and reconciliation with the Confederacy. The political battlefield was shifting, and while Washington faltered, Richmond acted. In October 1863, Jefferson Davis, emboldened by his diplomatic overtures, proposed an armistice. Not surrender, not even formal peace, but a cessation of hostilities to discuss mutual coexistence. It was a masterstroke. To the European powers watching from afar, Davis now appeared not just victorious, but reasonable. In London, debates raged in Parliament. Recognition of the Confederacy had long been considered a dangerous provocation of the United States. But now, amid continued cotton shortages and increasing influence from pro-Southern factions, Prime Minister Palmerston hesitated. British textile mills had begun laying off workers. French diplomats urged cooperation, hoping to gain support for Napoleon III's Mexican adventure. And in early December, the unthinkable happened. Britain extended provisional diplomatic recognition to the Confederate States of America. The Union reacted with fury. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles called it a betrayal dressed in silk and mobilized naval assets near British Caribbean holdings in response. But the damage was done. With one signature, Britain had shattered the illusion that the Confederacy was a temporary rebellion. In Richmond, cheers erupted in the streets. Cannons fired in celebration. Church bells rang across the South. For men like General James Longstreet, who had grown weary of war, the moment felt like a light at the end of a blood-soaked tunnel. But there was no peace. The Union could not abide secession, not just for ideological reasons, but for survival. A divided America could not dominate the continent. It could not protect its borders. It could not project power. And so, despite Lincoln's growing isolation, he refused to yield. In the winter of 1863, a new plan was drawn, one not of direct confrontation, but of strangulation. Lincoln ordered General Ulysses S. Grant to take full control of Union forces in the West, not just to capture territory, but to destroy Confederate infrastructure. Rail lines, mills, and communication hubs would become targets. The war would move beyond the battlefield and into the economic arteries of the South. The campaign began in Tennessee, then Mississippi. Towns were razed, rail yards set ablaze. Sherman, not yet infamous, rose quickly in Grant's ranks, his tactics already leaning toward what would later become known as total war. The goal was not to kill Confederate soldiers, it was to break the will of the Southern people. But it came at a terrible price. In Franklin, Tennessee, a Union raid resulted in the deaths of 87 civilians, most of them elderly and children, trapped when a granary was mistakenly burned. The incident was seized upon by the Confederate press, spun into tales of Northern barbarity. The narrative of Southern victimhood grew. Recruitment surged in Georgia and Alabama. Even men who had once doubted the war now felt compelled to protect their homes. In this crucible of rising violence and propaganda, the South grew hardened. Southern newspapers like the Richmond Inquirer began publishing visions of a post-war Confederacy, a slave-holding republic stretching from Virginia to Arizona, from Florida to perhaps even the northern reaches of Mexico. Ambitious plans circulated for a Confederate transcontinental railroad aimed to rival the Union's Pacific scheme. Southern politicians dreamed of annexing parts of Central America, citing the Monroe Doctrine as justification. Yet for the enslaved people of the South, the horrors deepened. With every Confederate victory, the institution of slavery became more entrenched. Fearing insurrection, plantation owners intensified patrols. Laws forbidding literacy and movement were brutally enforced. The Underground Railroad, already weakened by Southern gains, all but collapsed. Harriet Tubman, hunted relentlessly, fled to Canada with the last of her operatives. She wrote in her final letter from Halifax, "Liberty has no home in a land where men claim dominion over the very breath of others." But resistance did not die. In the swamps of Louisiana, freedmen who had fought for the Union formed guerrilla bands, striking at Confederate supply lines. In Charleston, a quiet network of black teachers continued to teach reading and scripture in secret, believing that someday freedom would return. And in the North, abolitionist voices, though now fewer, grew louder in defiance. Frederick Douglass warned in Boston, "If the Union sues for peace now, it sells its soul for silver." Amid this chaos, the presidential election of 1864 approached. Lincoln, besieged by criticism and plagued by military setbacks, considered not running at all. He confided in his secretary, John Nicolay, "Perhaps I was never meant to see peace, but I cannot leave this Union to ruin." He would run again, but not alone. To unify his base and appeal to moderates, Lincoln dropped Vice President Hannibal Hamlin and selected a Democrat, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Unionist from Tennessee, as his running mate. It was a risky gambit, one designed to present the image of reconciliation without surrender. The nation braced for an election that would decide not just the president, but the soul of the country. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis watched closely. He knew a Lincoln defeat could end the war on Southern terms. He knew the path to Confederate permanence ran not through bullets, but ballots. And in that quiet knowledge, he summoned his generals, his ministers, and his diplomats. The war was not over, not yet, because what came after was even more unexpected. The snow in Washington fell early in 1864, blanketing the capital in silence that belied the storm within. The Union was still intact, technically, but it no longer felt united. Every town hall meeting was a tinderbox. Every newspaper carried editorials that read more like battle cries than commentary. And at the heart of it all, the presidential election loomed like a final judgment. Abraham Lincoln's re-election campaign was met with skepticism across the North. Gettysburg was lost. The Confederacy had scored recognition from Britain, and France was now cautiously following suit. The Emancipation Proclamation had proven toothless in the face of Southern resilience. Even his own Republican Party splintered. Radicals accused Lincoln of being too moderate, while conservatives whispered that he had overstepped his mandate. The Democrats seized the moment. Their candidate was General George B. McClellan, the very man Lincoln had dismissed early in the war for inaction. Now he returned not in uniform, but as a political messiah for a tired, bloodied Union. His platform was peace, not surrender, not quite. but an armistice and the right of states, South and North, to self-determine. The code was clear: let the Confederacy go and stop the bloodshed. On paper, McClellan's odds looked good. Public opinion favored an end to the war. Draft riots still echoed in Northern memory. The economy buckled under military spending. And yet, Lincoln held on to one thing the South could never replicate: a moral cause. It was not enough for a people to grow weary of war. They had to believe the war still mattered. And Lincoln, in speeches that stirred even his most cynical detractors, reframed the conflict, not as a war to preserve the Union, but a war to define what kind of Union it would be. At a campaign stop in Springfield, he spoke beneath a cold sky to a silent crowd. If we let this nation split, if we allow this rebellion to form its own country upon the back of slaves, then we were never a free people. We were just a temporary arrangement. The speech resonated. So did the growing sense that the South, far from simply seeking independence, harbored ambitions beyond its borders. Reports leaked from Richmond of Southern designs on Cuba, on expanding westward, on treaties with Napoleon III in Mexico. The Confederacy, it seemed, was not content with survival. It hungered for empire. This revelation, combined with a string of Union victories in Tennessee under Grant's command, shifted the tide. Slowly, unevenly, but it shifted. In November 1864, against all odds, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected President of the United States. Richmond fell into stunned silence. Jefferson Davis had hoped the North would elect McClellan and pursue peace. Now, with Lincoln back in the saddle, the Confederacy faced a renewed threat, not just militarily, but spiritually. Lincoln no longer spoke as a wartime president. He spoke as a prophet of reunification, and his administration wasted no time. General William Tecumseh Sherman, now infamous for his ruthless efficiency, was ordered to begin a Southern campaign not aimed at armies, but at the South's ability to wage war. In December, he launched his scorched earth march through Georgia. Town by town, farm by farm, the Union Army leveled railroads, burned crops, and freed slaves along their path. Sherman's tactics were brutal. Many Northern officers questioned the morality of such destruction. But Grant understood, as did Lincoln. The Confederacy would never surrender unless it was made impossible to continue. And yet, resistance in the South did not crumble. It calcified. In the hills of northern Georgia, teenage boys joined militias. In the Carolinas, guerrilla fighters struck Sherman's flanks and disappeared into the forests. Women in Richmond sewed uniforms by candlelight, even as food shortages gripped the city. Slaveholders armed their slaves under supervision, promising eventual freedom in exchange for loyalty, an ironic, desperate gesture in a war built to preserve slavery. And still, the international community hovered at the edge of the conflict. Britain, though cautious, began receiving Confederate diplomats as official envoys. Confederate cotton slowly resumed trade through British Caribbean ports. France, eager to preserve its Mexican foothold, entered negotiations with Richmond for mutual recognition. The Confederacy was bleeding, but not broken. In January 1865, Robert E. Lee took command of all Confederate forces, centralizing military power in a last-ditch effort to resist Grant's relentless advance from the west and Sherman's devastation from the south. Richmond braced for siege. Davis, refusing to flee, hardened his rhetoric. We will fight not just for independence, but for survival, for the right to govern ourselves, as our fathers did. Yet inside his cabinet, cracks emerged. Vice President Alexander Stephens, a staunch defender of states' rights, began to question Davis's growing authoritarianism. Confederate congressmen worried that Davis was suspending too many civil liberties. Some whispered that the Confederacy had traded British tyranny for another kind, but none dared act, not yet. Meanwhile, Lincoln prepared for a second inauguration. This time, his words were somber, reflective. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. He spoke not just to Northerners, but to Southerners, to the future. But the past was not yet done bleeding. By March, Confederate morale waned. The population starved. The Army of Northern Virginia, outnumbered and undersupplied, could barely hold its lines. But Richmond had not fallen, and Davis had one last plan, one that would defy the conventions of honor and shake the war to its core. If the Union would not relent, then the war would have to change shape. A shadow network of operatives was activated. Confederate agents, previously used to smuggle goods through Union lines, now had a different mission: to carry fire into the North. Not by armies, by flame. In April, as Lincoln traveled to meet with Grant near Petersburg, a plot was set in motion. A Confederate sympathizer, hiding in the crowd, took aim at the president's carriage. The bullet missed, but only just. Panic swept through the Capitol. Rumors of a broader assassination campaign emerged. New York, Boston, and even Chicago prepared for possible sabotage. And within the Union War Department, the question surfaced: what if this was no longer a war of lines and uniforms, but of shadows? Because the Confederacy was dying, and it intended it to leave scars. And the next blow would strike the very heart of the Republic. The air in Washington turned sharp with panic. After the failed assassination attempt on President Lincoln, fear roamed freely through the city's corridors of power. Carriages were searched. The Potomac was lined with guards. The Capitol Dome, once a symbol of unity under construction in the war's early days, now loomed like a hollow shell over a country unraveling at its center. But if the North trembled, Richmond seethed with resolve. Jefferson Davis gathered his inner circle in a sealed chamber beneath the Confederate War Department. On the table lay a map, not of battlefronts, but of northern cities, circled in red: Washington, New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Beside each, a coded name. The Confederate Secret Service, long dismissed by Union generals as a minor threat, had now become the South's last great weapon. Davis didn't need to defeat the Union in the field. He only needed to break its will. The strategy, quietly authorized in February and accelerated after Lincoln's re-election, was simple in concept but dark in execution: widespread sabotage. Fires, explosions, poisonings, anything to disrupt the North's sense of security. The Confederacy had nothing to lose and everything to avenge. Lee was holding Richmond with bare-knuckled desperation. Sherman was slicing through the Carolinas, and Grant's hammer threatened from the west. The battlefield was lost, but the mind of the North could still be shaken, and so the agents moved. In New York, a fire broke out at Barnum's American Museum. It spread rapidly across several blocks before fire crews could contain it. Newspapers called it an accident. But in the shadows, Union intelligence pieced together whispers of an incendiary device left behind by a man who vanished into the night. In Boston, arsenic found its way into a shipment of flour bound for Union barracks. It was intercepted in time, but not before a handful of civilians fell ill. Panic bloomed in ports, in supply depots, in the homes of war-weary citizens. Washington, always the final target, was next. The attack came not on the president, but on the symbol of governance itself. In late April 1865, just as Lincoln returned from Grant's headquarters, a Confederate saboteur slipped into the Treasury building, posing as a clerk. A cache of explosives hidden beneath floorboards detonated after midnight. Flames devoured the eastern wing. Gold reserves were moved under heavy guard, and several departments were displaced. The nation awoke not just to destruction, but to humiliation. This was no longer a war. It was a reckoning. Lincoln's response was immediate and uncompromising. He invoked emergency powers to expand martial law across several northern cities, authorizing military tribunals for suspected saboteurs. Civil liberties advocates protested. Some journalists were jailed. Abolitionist papers decried the measures as antithetical to everything the Union claimed to represent. But Lincoln pressed forward. "We must not let our principles be used to destroy the Union that protects them," he said. Across the Mason-Dixon line, the Confederacy reveled in its chaos-making, but the victory was hollow. Lee could barely maintain supply lines. Richmond's civilian population was reduced to eating boiled leather and bark. Disease ran rampant. Railroad lines lay in ruin. And Sherman, now feared as the scourge of the South, stood just a week's march away. In that climate of collapse, a new and desperate discussion began within the Confederate cabinet: conditional emancipation. The irony was suffocating. A war built to defend slavery now faced its end under a proposal to offer freedom to enslaved men if they would pick up arms to defend the Confederacy. General Patrick Cleburne had suggested such a measure a year earlier and been silenced, but now, with Union forces nearing Richmond and manpower at a critical low, Davis reconsidered. The debate was fierce. Alexander Stephens vehemently opposed the idea, calling it the end of our moral claim to independence. Others, like Judah P. Benjamin, saw it as the only chance to secure foreign aid and delay total collapse. On May 3, 1865, the Confederate Congress passed the measure. Barely. It promised gradual emancipation to any enslaved man who fought in defense of the Confederacy. The reaction was mixed. Some black men enlisted, hoping for a freedom they'd never seen. Others resisted, seeing in the offer a cynical ploy for survival. In Northern newspapers, the development was mocked as hypocrisy, but inside Lincoln's cabinet, the move caused deep unease. If the Confederacy survives by ending slavery, wrote Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, we may win the war and lose the argument. By mid-May, the Union siege of Richmond began in earnest. Grant surrounded the city with a precision that left no escape routes. Sherman burned his way northward from Fayetteville. The rivers were blockaded, the telegraph lines cut. And inside Richmond, Jefferson Davis began to prepare for evacuation. But he was not fleeing. He had another plan. A train was loaded with Confederate gold, military archives, and Davis's personal belongings. It left Richmond under heavy guard on May 28th, headed for Montgomery, Alabama, the Confederacy's original capital, now a possible seat of government in exile. Lee, though ill and exhausted, agreed to stay behind and lead the final defense. On June 2nd, the siege turned into a storm. Union artillery pounded Richmond from three sides. Fires broke out across the city. Civilians crowded the churches, praying not for victory, but for mercy. And at City Point, a Union field hospital brimmed with wounded soldiers and Confederate deserters alike, both speaking in the same dazed, shell-shocked tones. For the first time, the lines that divided blue and gray began to blur into red. Then came the moment that would shock the world. In the early hours of June 6, 1865, as Union troops breached the final Southern defenses, Robert E. Lee surrendered. Not just his army, but the city. He did not meet Grant in a courthouse. He met him in the smoking ruins of the Virginia state capitol. The surrender was swift, solemn, and quiet. But Jefferson Davis was gone, and with him, the Confederate government vanished into the hills and bayous of the Deep South. Not defeated, but disbanded. The war, officially, was ending, but the South had not surrendered, because in every burned-out town, in every hollowed-out plantation, in every swamp harboring militias and guerrillas, something darker was taking root. The Confederacy had lost its capital, but it had not lost its will. And what rose from the ashes was no longer a government. It was something far harder to kill. Richmond was quiet now, not the quiet of peace, but of exhaustion. Smoke curled from the blackened husks of buildings, mingling with the scent of rain and ash. Union flags fluttered above what remained of the Capitol. Federal troops moved through the rubble, not as liberators, but as weary survivors of a long and bitter siege. And beneath their boots, a different war was already beginning. Robert E. Lee, newly paroled, had vanished into private life. Offered a position in Lincoln's Reconstruction government, he declined with measured words and sunken eyes. "I have done all I can," he said, "and what remains must be done by others." He retired to a modest home in Lexington, Virginia, taking up a post at a small college that would one day bear his name. But Lee's departure from public life only fueled his legend. In the defeated South, he was no longer merely a general. He became a martyr. All across the former Confederacy, whispers turned into stories, and stories into scripture. The lost cause narrative was born not in books, but around hearths and graveyards. In Savannah, mothers told their children the South had not truly been defeated, only overwhelmed by numbers and industry. In Alabama, pastors preached sermons equating the Confederacy's fall with the trials of Christ, righteousness crucified by a world too blind to understand it. Jefferson Davis, still at large and broadcasting defiance from exile in Texas, became the voice of the underground resistance. The South was not conquered, he declared in one telegram smuggled to sympathizers in Louisiana. It was betrayed by weakness and overrun by force. But its spirit remains eternal. His message resonated with the millions of Southerners who had lost everything: land, sons, pride, and now sought meaning in the rubble. The official surrender had brought no closure. President Lincoln, meanwhile, moved quickly to stabilize the post-war South. He saw in victory not vengeance, but opportunity, a chance to bind the nation's wounds. His plan was generous: amnesty for most Confederate soldiers, reconstruction funds for devastated towns, and even limited representation for Southern states in Congress if they accepted the 13th Amendment and renounced the Confederacy. But this leniency came at a cost. In the Deep South, resentment metastasized into resistance. Federal outposts were burned in the dead of night. Black Union veterans were lynched on roadsides. Northern teachers sent to educate freedmen were run out of towns. In Mississippi, an entire schoolhouse was torched with its students still inside. The term Reconstruction became a cruel joke in places where destruction never really ended. And so, a new kind of Confederacy took shape, not one of governments and armies, but of shadows and symbols. Former Confederate officers formed vigilance committees to police their towns, targeting black citizens and Union loyalists with impunity. These would evolve into more sinister organizations. By late 1865, in Pulaski, Tennessee, a secret society of ex-Confederates calling themselves the Ku Klux Klan began a campaign of terror. Their white hoods became ghosts of a war that refused to die. Lincoln, anguished, saw what was coming. He pushed Congress to authorize a military occupation of the South, to protect the freedmen, to disband the militias, to crush the lingering embers of rebellion. Radical Republicans supported the move, demanding harsher penalties, land redistribution, and trials for Confederate leaders. But Lincoln's authority, though strong, was not absolute. The North was exhausted. The elections of 1866 saw Democrats regaining ground in border states and northern cities. Many voters wanted unity, but not if it meant indefinite occupation, not if it meant more taxes, not if it meant they had to continue sacrificing for people they'd never met. It was in this moment of national fatigue that tragedy struck. On the evening of March 23, 1866, President Lincoln attended a benefit performance at Ford's Theater, a public act intended to reassure a divided nation. But as he greeted the crowd, a gunshot rang out, followed by a scream. This time, the assassin did not miss. Lincoln collapsed in the presidential box, blood soaking the American flag draped beside him. Though rushed to a nearby boarding house, he died the next morning. The nation erupted in grief, but not confusion. Everyone knew who had pulled the trigger, even before the arrest. It was not John Wilkes Booth. That man had died in another timeline. This time, it was a Confederate veteran from Kentucky. A quiet man, no affiliations, no manifestos. Just a revolver, a hate-soaked heart, and the belief that one bullet could redeem the South. It did not. Instead, it handed the presidency to Andrew Johnson. A Southern Unionist and a Democrat by temperament, Johnson inherited Lincoln's fragile coalition and shattered it within weeks. He vetoed key civil rights bills. He resisted calls for harsher treatment of the South. He pardoned Confederate leaders en masse. Reconciliation, he said, must begin with forgiveness. But what looked like forgiveness in Washington looked like surrender in Charleston. Freedmen, once jubilant, now feared for their lives. Black legislators elected under federal protection were attacked or assassinated. Southern states passed black codes, laws designed to replicate the conditions of slavery under new names. In Louisiana, a freedman who refused to defer to a white man on a sidewalk was dragged into the woods and hung. Resistance was not just tolerated, it was systematized. And yet, hope persisted. Frederick Douglass, now older but undeterred, published a blistering open letter to Johnson. "You speak of healing wounds, but you do not ask who inflicted them. You speak of restoring the South, but not of raising the man still chained beneath its flag." His words galvanized the Northern press, though Johnson dismissed them. The divide between North and South was no longer military, it was moral. And in this void, something shifted globally. The European powers, once courted by the Confederacy, watched in silence as America stumbled through its false peace. Britain, relieved the war was over, quietly resumed full diplomatic ties with Washington. France, occupied in Mexico, withdrew its interests from the American theater. And Russia, eager to see a strong United States counterbalance British global influence, offered its navy as a gesture of alliance. But inside America, unity was a myth. Two nations still existed. One above the Mason-Dixon line, bound by law and uneasy victory. The other below it, alive in spirit, culture, and ideology. Even without a flag, the Civil War had ended, but the Confederate dream had not. And in the dark places where memory and myth entwined, that dream would wait, sharp as ever, waiting for a resurrection. The year was 1868, and the South was simmering beneath a brittle layer of federal authority. Carpetbagger governors oversaw Reconstruction governments, guarded by Union troops and hated by much of the white population. Courthouses flew American flags, but the real laws were written in back rooms and enforced with rifle butts and torches. For every proclamation from Washington, there was a response in the shadows. From the ashes of defeat, the Confederacy had reemerged, not in name, not in law, but in belief. The Ku Klux Klan, once a local gang of masked vigilantes, now operated as a sprawling paramilitary network across the South. Its hierarchy was secretive but methodical. Grand Dragons led state branches, while Night Riders enforced loyalty at the community level. Lynchings became acts of terror and ritual. Crosses burned like war drums. Entire black communities were driven from their homes under threat of mass violence. And in Montgomery, Alabama, the old Confederate capital, an underground council composed of former generals, planters, and ex-politicians met in secret. They called themselves the Sons of the South. Their mission, to restore the spirit of the Confederacy through subversion, not secession. Their strategy was built on 5 pillars. 1. Cultural dominance. Southern schools rewrote history books to depict the Confederacy as a noble cause. Children learned not of slavery's horrors, but of valor and states' rights. Churches preached forgiveness, but only for those who had fought under the stars and bars. 2. Economic resurgence. With slavery abolished, the plantation system adapted into sharecropping, a system that replicated servitude under a different name. Freedmen worked the same fields, under the same overseers, for a pittance. Debt replaced chains, and the cotton flowed again. 3. Political infiltration. Using intimidation and fraud, the Sons of the South sought to reclaim state legislatures. Where black men voted, their ballots disappeared. Where they ran for office, they were threatened or killed. By 1870, Democratic redeemers were sweeping elections across the South. 4. Legal resistance. Southern courts refused to enforce federal civil rights protections. When prosecuted, local juries acquitted vigilantes or refused to indict them altogether. In one Mississippi county, 27 black men were murdered in a single month. No one was arrested. 5. Federal frustration. The ultimate goal was to wear down Washington's resolve. Every murdered schoolteacher, every torched Freedmen's Bureau office, was a message. You cannot change us. President Andrew Johnson, already weak and isolated, offered little resistance. He issued more pardons. He condemned Klan violence in vague terms, but refused to use federal troops to intervene. Radical Republicans in Congress moved to impeach him, And while they failed by a single vote, the message was clear. Johnson had become an obstacle to justice. Then came 1868's presidential election, and a man forged in the fire of war returned. Ulysses S. Grant, hero of Vicksburg and Richmond, accepted the Republican nomination with solemn resolve. "Let us have peace," he said. But everyone knew what he meant: peace through strength. He won by a landslide, with overwhelming support from black voters in the South and war veterans in the North. And once in office, he moved swiftly. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, known as the Grant Acts, gave federal troops the authority to arrest and prosecute members of the Klan. Thousands were jailed. Militias were broken up. Secret meetings were raided. In South Carolina, an entire county was placed under martial law. For a brief, shining moment, justice surged like a river in flood. But the South had adapted before, and it would again. The Klan retreated, but new groups emerged. The White League, the Red Shirts, the Rifle Clubs. They dropped the hoods and adopted uniforms. They framed their resistance not as terror, but as law and order. Southern newspapers spoke of defending white civilization. The term New Confederacy began appearing in coded language, referring not to a nation, but to an identity. Meanwhile, Confederate exiles who had fled to Brazil, Cuba, and Mexico began returning home. Many had been slaveholders seeking to rebuild their fortunes abroad. Their tales of loss and pride were romanticized in Southern papers. One such man, Colonel Ambrose Kane of Louisiana, published a memoir titled Ashes of Glory, which became a Southern bestseller. In it, he wrote, "We lost a war, but not our country, for our country lives wherever the Southern man teaches his son the true flag." This ideological revival wasn't limited to Dixie. In the West, the balance of power was shifting. The U.S. government's attention to Reconstruction meant fewer troops on the frontier. Native tribes, emboldened, began resisting westward expansion more effectively. The Great Sioux War erupted earlier than in our own timeline. In California, anti-Chinese sentiment exploded as white workers blamed immigrants for job losses during the recession of 1873. Amid this national unrest, the South began winning the narrative. By 1875, reconciliation became the buzzword in Washington. Northern newspapers urged forgiveness. Public interest in black suffrage waned. Reconstruction was increasingly seen not as noble, but as a costly failure. Even some Republicans began calling for a return to normalcy, and then came the final blow. In 1876, another contested presidential election rocked the nation. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes faced Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote, but the Electoral College was thrown into chaos over 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, all still under federal occupation, with widespread voter suppression and intimidation on both sides. The nation teetered on the edge of a second civil conflict. To avoid bloodshed, the infamous Compromise of 1877 was struck behind closed doors. Hayes would become president, but only if he agreed to withdraw all federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction. He agreed. And with that, the last garrisons departed. Freedmen's schools closed. Black legislators were ousted. The Southern states passed new constitutions codifying segregation, voting restrictions, and economic bondage. The Union had survived, but it had paid with its conscience. In Mississippi, a statue of Robert E. Lee was erected beneath a Confederate flag, freshly unfurled. The inscription read, "He never surrendered, he waited." Because the South had not risen again, it had never truly fallen, and its phoenix, born from fire and myth, was only just beginning to spread its wings. By the dawn of the 1880s, the United States was a country pretending to be whole. The stars on the flag had never changed, still 38, still stitched with the same precision. But beneath that banner, 2 nations walked in parallel. One marched into industrial modernity, humming with the promise of steam and steel. The other marched backward, deeper into the myths of cotton, conquest, and blood. The Union had won the war, yes, But the Confederacy had won the peace of memory. What rose in the South during the post-Reconstruction era was not a new republic, but a covert empire, an empire of shadows. It had no president, no official borders, no diplomatic corps, but it had schools, it had newspapers, it had churches and courthouses and parades where men in gray marched beneath the stars and bars, as if Appomattox had been nothing more than a bad dream. The cult of the Confederacy became institutional. Statues of Lee, Jackson, and Davis sprang up in every major Southern city, funded not by state governments, but by local women's societies, veteran groups, and heritage foundations. These monuments weren't just tributes. They were weapons of narrative, forged to rewrite the meaning of the war. Textbooks across Southern states described slavery as a benevolent institution, recast the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression, and painted the Reconstruction era as a time of chaotic misrule by unqualified Negroes and Northern interlopers. Children grew up believing their ancestors had been wronged, not defeated. A generation of Southerners came of age angry not at slavery, but at emancipation. Meanwhile, Black Americans, freedmen and their descendants, found themselves slowly, methodically erased from public life. The Jim Crow laws began as whispers in state legislatures, but hardened into a caste system enforced by gunpoint and gavel. Separate rail cars, separate schools, separate water fountains. In Mississippi, a Black man could be arrested for merely glancing at a white woman. In Alabama, Black teachers were forbidden from using white textbooks. Voting rights were extinguished through poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and literacy tests designed to fail. By 1890, Black voter turnout in Louisiana dropped by 96%. It was a slow suffocation, done in silence. Northern politicians, eager to win Southern votes or maintain national harmony, turned away. The Gilded Age had arrived, and the great focus of the Union was now wealth, not justice. Corporations spread across the continent. Railroads cut through tribal lands. Millionaires toasted themselves in New York ballrooms, and in the shadows of Southern towns, Black men were lynched from trees while juries yawned. The federal government, wary of reopening old wounds, treated the South as a wounded brother. Temperamental, perhaps, but still kin. The phrase, "let bygones be bygones," became a national mantra. But in doing so, they allowed a defeated ideology to root itself anew. And as the 20th century approached, the South's shadow began to spread beyond its region. Southern politicians, long marginalized in post-war Washington, slowly clawed their way back to influence. They joined national committees, chaired congressional caucuses. Some even reached cabinet positions, and with each new foothold, they brought with them the culture of the lost cause, framed not as treason, but tradition. In 1896, the Supreme Court handed down Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring separate but equal constitutional. It was a quiet revolution, a formal green light for apartheid within a democracy. Southern lawmakers celebrated. Northern liberals blinked in disbelief. The South, once forced at gunpoint to rejoin the Union, was now reshaping it. And beyond America's borders, the Confederate legacy whispered to empires abroad. When the United States invaded the Philippines in 1898, many of the officers leading Black regiments were Southerners, veterans of the Indian Wars. They spoke of Filipinos as little brown rebels, echoing the language once used for enslaved Africans. Some Black soldiers, disillusioned by the racism they faced at home and abroad, deserted. Others published letters in Black newspapers warning that the new American empire was built atop the same foundation as the old Confederate dream. Meanwhile, in Europe, Southern culture found admirers. French monarchists saw in the lost cause a model of noble resistance. German aristocrats praised Southern honor codes. And in Britain, the same empire that had once flirted with recognizing the Confederacy now published novels romanticizing the antebellum South as a land of gallantry and grace. The Confederate myth had become exportable. But beneath the surface, resistance smoldered. In Black churches, in secret reading circles, in blues songs sung under moonlight, the true history was kept alive. Elders told their children, Don't believe their stories. We remember the chains. We remember the dogs. Black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois began rising from the margins, writing essays that challenged the lies written in marble and granite. A cultural war was brewing, one not fought with bayonets, but with truth. Yet in this empire of shadows, truth was dangerous. When Black editor Ida B. Wells published a series of investigative reports on lynchings in Tennessee, her newspaper office was burned to the ground. When she fled to the north, Southern leaders demanded her arrest for inciting unrest, but she would not be silenced. "This country pretends to be one nation," she wrote, "but its heartbeat is divided. And in that division, a lie has been allowed to rule." That lie, the nobility of the Confederacy, the fiction of its righteousness, was no longer regional. It had metastasized into national culture. It was in the speeches of senators, the textbooks of children, the architecture of courthouses. The Confederacy had never needed to rise again. It had merely changed form, no longer a rebellion, but a ghost. No longer a flag, but a whisper in the soul of a nation that still couldn't face its own reflection. And as the century turned, the storm clouds gathered once more, because a new generation was rising, one that would not forget, and one that would not forgive. The year was 1914, and the world stood on the brink of a storm no one yet understood. In Europe, archdukes fell and empires rattled their sabers. In America, the South basked in the illusion of permanence. Jim Crow was law. Confederate monuments dotted courtyards like ancient runes. The lost cause was no longer just a Southern narrative. It was embedded in the marrow of the nation's consciousness. But marble, no matter how grandly carved, eventually cracks. It began with voices, soft, scattered, and often ignored. But they grew. In the North, W.E.B. Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk, a piercing dissection of the post-war lie America had told itself. His pen cut through the myths of benevolent slavery and honorable rebellion, exposing the rot beneath. He called Reconstruction the finest moment of American democracy, betrayed by cowardice and greed. Southern politicians dismissed him as a radical, but his words traveled far, into classrooms, churches, and the ears of a generation born long after the last shots at Appomattox. Meanwhile, Black veterans from the Spanish-American War returned home with scars and expectations. They had fought under the same flag, bled on the same fields. But in Georgia, a sergeant was lynched for refusing to call a white man "sir." In Texas, a unit of Black cavalrymen were disarmed and dishonorably discharged after defending themselves from a racist mob. The message was clear: the Confederacy's shadow still ruled. And yet, cracks appeared. Industrialization had begun to shift the demographics of power. Northern cities, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, were booming, and they needed workers. Black families fled the South in waves in what would become known as the Great Migration. They left behind the cotton fields and the lynching trees and boarded trains headed for cold streets and uncertain futures. But in those cities, they found something the South had denied them: voice. They built newspapers, jazz halls, labor unions, and schools. They elected aldermen, formed defense leagues, and learned to speak the language of resistance, not just in sermons, but in courtrooms. In 1915, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation premiered to sold-out crowds across the country. Based on Thomas Dixon's pro-Klan novel The Klansman, it was a cinematic marvel and a cultural tragedy. Audiences wept as hooded riders galloped to the rescue of white civilization. President Woodrow Wilson screened it in the White House, calling it history written in lightning. It reawakened the sleeping giant of the Klan. Membership exploded. Crosses burned anew. But this time, the flames were answered. In Harlem, Black intellectuals called for boycotts. In Boston, protests shut down theaters. In Chicago, a riot broke out after a screening, leaving 2 dead and dozens wounded. For the first time, public pushback against the myth of the Confederacy reached a national scale. Still in the South, the machine endured. Southern senators filibustered anti-lynching laws. Schools banned Du Bois's writings. Textbooks glorified Lee and erased Frederick Douglass. The Democratic Party, the party of the Old South, tightened its grip on Washington. And as America entered World War I, Southern generals commanded black regiments that were denied the very freedoms they fought for in Europe. But war, as always, changed things. The trenches of France were a crucible. Black soldiers fought under French command to escape segregation in U.S. units. They earned medals, respect, and a dangerous new confidence. When they returned, they carried with them not just trauma, but clarity. In 1919, a wave of racial violence swept the country in what would be called Red Summer. In over 36 cities, white mobs attacked black communities. In Chicago, a black teenager was stoned to death for swimming in the wrong part of Lake Michigan. Riots erupted. Buildings burned. Federal troops were deployed. Yet something was different now. This time, black communities fought back. In Washington, D.C., black veterans armed themselves and patrolled their neighborhoods. In Knoxville and Omaha, they traded fire with police and vigilantes. For the first time since Reconstruction, resistance was organized and armed. The federal government, nervous and unprepared, began to reassess its silence. While Southern politicians called for more crackdowns, progressive voices in Congress began pushing for civil rights commissions and investigations into racial violence. Nothing passed, but the silence was no longer universal, and the South watched uneasily. The marble foundations of their myth were trembling. In New Orleans, a historian dared to suggest that slavery, not tariffs or sovereignty, had been the true cause of the war. He was denounced as a traitor. His career ended, but the seed was planted. The North, too, was no longer immune to scrutiny. As race riots spread, Northern newspapers began to revisit their own complicity in the Confederate resurrection. Editorials questioned how a defeated ideology had become a national identity. How had America gone from ending slavery to enshrining its defenders in bronze? It was as if the entire country was awakening to a question it had buried for 50 years. What had it actually won in 1865? Not equality, not unity, only silence. In black churches, sermons once focused on heaven now preached the urgency of earth. In colleges, professors challenged the textbooks. In homes, families gathered around phonographs playing the blues. A music born from sorrow but laced with defiance. And in the halls of Congress, the first black representatives since Reconstruction prepared to take their seats, elected from northern cities by the children of those who had fled Southern terror. The South could still control its states, but not the nation, not forever. Because as one generation aged beneath the monuments of marble and myth, another was rising with a chisel in hand, and they no longer believed in ghosts. The reckoning would come, not with cannon fire, but with memory sharpened into a blade. And the century's midpoint would be the battleground, not of land, but of truth. By the time the calendar turned to 1954, the Confederate myth was no longer safe, not in books, not in schools, and certainly not in stone. It began not with a bullet or a riot, but with 9 black children and a courtroom decision. Brown v. Board of Education declared what black Americans had known for nearly a century, that separate but equal was a lie. The Supreme Court had finally struck at the legal cornerstone of segregation, and with it, the ideological scaffolding that had held the lost cause aloft for generations. The response from the South was immediate and defiant. In Little Rock, Arkansas, white mobs gathered outside Central High School like an army of ghosts summoned by the death of an era. National Guard troops were deployed, not to protect the students, but to block them. President Eisenhower, reluctantly, sent federal troops to enforce the ruling. Bayonets escorted children to class. The image seared itself into history. Black students walking through jeering crowds, flanked by soldiers, as if invading enemy territory. And in many ways, they were. The South saw itself not as defeated, but occupied once again. By a foreign morality, by distant judges in Washington, by a federal government that had long since abandoned its promises. From Jackson to Birmingham, Governors invoked interposition, claiming states had the right to defy the court. It was a constitutional fantasy, but it gave the Confederacy's children a new flag to rally behind. White citizens' councils sprang up overnight. Unlike the Klan, they wore suits and spoke with legalese, but their purpose was the same: to preserve white supremacy under the guise of order. They lobbied school boards, funded private academies, and published textbooks that softened the language of the past without changing its message. But their grip was loosening. The civil rights movement had begun, not with fanfare, but with footsteps. In Montgomery, Rosa Parks sat. In Greensboro, students refused to leave lunch counters. In Mississippi, Medgar Evers walked to work each day knowing his name was already carved into a bullet. Their protests were quiet, disciplined, defiant, and above all, televised. America, for the first time, was being forced to look at itself. Images of peaceful protesters, brutalized by police dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham, shocked the conscience of a generation raised on the myths of American fairness. Northern whites, previously content to pity black Southerners from afar, began asking questions. Why are Confederate flags flying in public buildings? Why are statues of traitors guarding courthouses? Why are children being beaten for demanding the rights they were promised 100 years ago? In response, the South doubled down. Between 1954 and 1965, more Confederate monuments were erected than in any previous era. Schools were named after Jefferson Davis. Parks were rededicated to Robert E. Lee. Highways were christened after Stonewall Jackson. It was a calculated act of resistance, an architectural rebellion against the arc of justice. But the tide had turned. In 1963, in the sweltering heat of Washington, D.C., a new voice shattered the silence. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial, a monument built to the man who had once broken the Confederacy, and declared that America had defaulted on its promissory note of liberty. "I have a dream," he said, but he also had a warning. The movement had begun in the church pews and community halls, but it was evolving. Younger leaders, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton, were growing impatient. "Nonviolence," they said, "is a tactic, not a religion." In Oakland and Detroit, rifles were shouldered alongside books. The Black Panther Party patrolled the streets not just to defend black lives, but to declare a sovereign dignity the state refused to recognize. Meanwhile, Southern defiance grew desperate. Governor George Wallace stood on the steps of the University of Alabama and bellowed, "Segregation now! Segregation tomorrow! Segregation forever!" Us? Shing. But within months, federal agents walked past him. The Confederate stance was no longer legally sustainable. It was now purely symbolic. And symbols can burn. In 1965, after Selma, after the Edmund Pettus Bridge was stained with blood, the Voting Rights Act passed. Black Americans began to vote in numbers unseen since Reconstruction. New faces appeared on city councils, on ballots, in congressional offices. And with them came a reckoning. The first legal challenges to Confederate monuments began in the late 60s. In Memphis, civil rights groups sued to remove a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, a slave trader, Confederate general, and early leader of the Ku Klux Klan. The city refused, but the debate spread. Was it heritage or hate, memory or menace? It was no longer just a Southern issue. In Boston, civil rights activists protested schools named after Confederate generals. In California, new immigrants from Asia and Latin America questioned why cities lionized men who had fought to keep other human beings in chains. The myth was cracking, not just in history books, but in daily life. And as America turned to the 1970s, the movement changed form again. Now it was not just about rights, but recognition. Not just about ending segregation, but dismantling the lies that upheld it. The Confederacy, once buried beneath marble and moss, was being exhumed and interrogated. Black scholars unearthed plantation records, diaries, economic data, evidence that slavery was not just a Southern quirk, but the economic backbone of a nation that had built its banks and railroads on blood. Activists exposed how the Confederate mythology had crept into federal institutions, how textbooks in 50 states still taught children that slavery was not so bad, or that the Civil War was about economics. And white America, confronted with a mirror, did not always like what it saw. Some resisted, others repented, but most simply drifted, unsure of how to reconcile pride with truth. And in that confusion, the monuments remained, some guarded by law, some defaced in the night, others quietly removed and replaced with playgrounds. But a reckoning had begun, because the children of the Confederacy were not the only ones raised on myth. So too were the descendants of those enslaved, and their children no longer bowed to statues. They carried hammers and history. The Monument War was not over. It had only just begun, and what came next would be decided not in the courts, but in the streets. The year was 2015, and the wind shifted in Charleston. At Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the oldest black churches in the South, a white supremacist walked in, sat for Bible study, listened, prayed, and then pulled out a gun. 9 souls were taken in the sanctuary that had survived slavery, Jim Crow, and a century of terrorism. But the bullet wasn't just aimed at those men and women, it was aimed at history. When police arrested the shooter, he was draped in the flags of apartheid South Africa and the Confederate States of America. The symbols were no longer vague, no longer buried in marble. The past had pulled a trigger, and the nation could no longer pretend the Confederacy was dead. Charleston became a flashpoint. Activists demanded the removal of the Confederate battle flag from the grounds of the South Carolina state capitol. The governor, Nikki Haley, long resistant, finally relented under national pressure. In July, the flag came down to the cheers of thousands. The pole remained for now, but the symbol was lowered under the weight of blood. It should have been a turning point, but it was only a spark. Across the South, protests erupted outside courthouses, state houses, and schools. Anywhere a Confederate statue still stood. Cities like New Orleans, Richmond, and Birmingham faced lawsuits and legislative battles as local governments moved to dismantle the monuments. Some were removed quietly at night, others under armed guard, while protesters chanted and counter-protesters waved battle flags and screamed of heritage. But what was that heritage really? Historians took to social media and newsrooms, reminding the public that most of these statues had been erected not in the 1860s, but in the 1920s, during the height of Jim Crow, and in the 1950s and 60s, as retaliation against civil rights advancements. They weren't memorials, they were warnings. Still, resistance was fierce. Southern legislatures passed monument protection acts, making it illegal to remove or alter any Confederate statue without state approval. In Alabama, fines were imposed. In Tennessee, lawmakers threatened to revoke state funding from any city that dared to challenge the legacy. The war for memory was fully ignited. Then came Charlottesville. In August 2017, white nationalists descended on the Virginia college town for a rally billed as Unite the Right. Their stated goal, to stop the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee. But what emerged was something darker. Men with torches, chanting, "Jews will not replace us," bearing shields emblazoned with Confederate flags and Nazi symbols, converging in open defiance of modernity. On the second day of the rally, one of them rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer and injuring dozens. The image flashed across the world, and with it came a chilling realization. The Confederacy had not stayed in books or battlefields, it had become a brand. A rallying cry for those who saw democracy, equality, and diversity as threats. The line from 1861 to 2017 was no longer academic. It was a pipeline. In response, cities acted, faster now, bolder. Baltimore removed 4 Confederate statues in a single night. Lexington, Kentucky followed. In Memphis, activists worked around state bans by selling the land under monuments to private nonprofits, who promptly removed them. But the backlash roared. President Donald Trump, in a press conference days after Charlottesville, said, "You had some very fine people on both sides." He added, So this week, it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next? Is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? The message was clear. Defending the Confederacy was now a partisan issue, and the Confederacy, reborn as political rhetoric, found new defenders. Online communities exploded with lost cause nostalgia, blending historical revisionism with conspiracy theory. Militias trained in the woods. Flags flew from trucks, not porches. The Confederacy had evolved, not into a government, but into a movement. Then came George Floyd. In May 2020, a Minneapolis police officer knelt on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes while cameras recorded and the world watched in horror. The reaction was seismic. Protests erupted in all 50 states, across racial and generational lines. But the chants were not just for justice, they were for reckoning. In Richmond, protesters toppled the statue of Jefferson Davis, defaced monuments to Lee, and occupied spaces long claimed by Confederate memory. Graffiti covered bronze. "This is not history, this is hate." In Portsmouth, protesters brought down statues with ropes and bare hands. In D.C., Black Lives Matter Plaza was painted in block letters just steps from the White House. In the Capitol itself, calls rang out to rename military bases and federal buildings named after Confederate leaders. Even the military began to speak. Generals publicly supported removing Confederate names from installations like Fort Bragg and Fort Hood. The Pentagon quietly reviewed symbols in use. The tide was not just turning, it was rushing. But the resistance doubled down. Armed groups stormed state capitals under the banner of protecting history. Online disinformation campaigns surged. Monuments were guarded by men in tactical gear, claiming to defend American heritage from Marxist mobs. The Confederate flag flew in places it had never flown before: Michigan, Oregon, Idaho. It had become untethered from geography, from fact, from shame. And then, in January 2021, the flag crossed the Rubicon. During the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, as rioters smashed windows and stormed the Senate chamber, one man carried the Confederate battle flag through the halls of Congress, past statues of Lincoln, past the doors where the Union had once been preserved by blood. It had taken 160 years, but the Confederacy, even in death, had breached the Capitol. And yet, there was no Southern nation now, no president in Richmond, no gray-clad armies, just symbols, myths, and millions of Americans who could no longer agree on what their country stood for. The past had never ended. It had merely changed form. In classrooms, debates raged over how to teach slavery and secession. In school boards, parents fought over curricula that dared challenge the lost cause. In digital spaces, teenagers read threads that dismantled Confederate propaganda in seconds. And in homes across the South, Black and white families alike reckoned with their grandparents' truths. The fire in the streets was not just rage, it was revelation. A reckoning not only with the Confederacy, but with America's selective memory. Because if monuments are what a nation chooses to remember, then the fight over them is not about the past. It's about who gets to define the future, and the battle for that future was about to move to its final arena. It was 2025, and the lines were no longer drawn by geography, but by belief. There was no formal Confederacy, no government in Richmond, no formal secession. And yet, the culture war ignited by a flag long dead was more alive than ever. It burned in legislatures and courtrooms, in classrooms and dinner tables, on podcasts and campaign trails. The old Confederacy had not returned in military columns. It had metastasized in memory, politics, and identity. In dozens of Southern towns, Confederate monuments still stood, some fenced off and graffitied, others polished weekly like altars to a vanished god. In many of these towns, Black citizens drove past them every day on their way to schools where the textbooks still named the Civil War as a dispute over states' rights, and never quite mentioned what those rights were. But the younger generation had different plans. What began as scattered protests became a network. Students at the University of Mississippi staged a weeks-long sit-in, demanding the removal of the Lee statue from the center of campus. They weren't content with gestures. They demanded not just removal, but replacement. Not erasure, but reckoning. Their words spread like fire online. Hashtags multiplied. History teachers in Atlanta posted TikToks debunking lost cause myths. Virtual museums, curated by young historians, began replacing schoolbooks. Memorials once hidden in basements were digitized. Records of lynchings, slave auction ledgers, Reconstruction-era testimonies. The truth was no longer confined to dusty libraries. It was viral. But the resistance to truth was equally organized. In Texas, a new curriculum bill passed that restricted the teaching of divisive concepts. Teachers were warned not to politicize history. Legislators rebranded Confederate leaders as founding figures of regional heritage. In Georgia, the state banned the removal of any military monument, regardless of origin. The law was designed to protect statues of Davis and Lee, but it also froze history in amber. And in Washington, a new political bloc rose from the ashes of the old Dixiecrat wing. Calling themselves American Restorationists, their platform was draped in euphemisms. Family values, national sovereignty, historical integrity. But behind the slogans lay a simple truth. They were the children of the lost cause, newly dressed in stars and stripes. Their rallies were orderly, polished, media-friendly. But always, somewhere in the crowd, a Confederate flag could be found. Sometimes on a belt buckle, sometimes on a decal, sometimes flying boldly in defiance. It was never the center, just a whisper. But the whisper was louder than speeches. The battle over monuments became a battle over meaning. And then, the spark returned. In Selma, Alabama, a city sacred to the civil rights movement, a Confederate monument was defaced. This time, it wasn't spray paint. It was torn down, dragged through the streets, and burned in front of the county courthouse. The act was filmed, shared, condemned, celebrated. Across the South, it triggered a chain reaction. In Louisville, protesters poured red paint over a statue of John Hunt Morgan. In Tennessee, activists renamed city streets unofficially, replacing signs with those of Harriet Tubman and Nat Turner. Overnight, it seemed, a century's worth of stone and bronze became vulnerable. But not everyone watched passively. In Jackson, Mississippi, a militia calling itself the Sons of Vicksburg staged an armed standoff when a local council voted to remove a Confederate memorial. They surrounded the statue, rifles in hand, daring police to intervene. The situation escalated for 3 days before federal marshals arrived. The statue was taken down, at night, without ceremony, behind a wall of silence. No shots were fired, but the message was clear. This was no longer symbolic. This was the edge of civil conflict. In the days that followed, state capitals were flooded with demands. Some from activists calling for truth and reconciliation commissions, others from Confederate heritage groups demanding monument protection zones and federal recognition of Southern history rights. It became the most contentious political issue in a generation. And yet, amid the shouting, a quieter force moved into play. The descendants of the enslaved and of the enslavers began speaking not at each other, but to each other. In Virginia, a white descendant of Robert E. Lee held a joint press conference with the great-great-granddaughter of a man Lee had once enslaved. Together, they unveiled a new historical center, dedicated not to the Confederacy, but to the Reconstruction era, its promise and its betrayal. In Charleston, black and white churches organized a year of reckoning, hosting events that laid bare the economic, theological, and cultural complicity in the lost cause. Donations poured in. Pilgrimages followed. For the first time, parts of the South began writing a new identity, not one rooted in war, but in truth. And in Washington, a new bill was introduced, the National Memory Act. It called for a federal audit of every Confederate monument on public land, not just for removal, but for historical context. Some would be relocated, Some would receive plaques detailing their origins in white supremacy. Others would remain as educational tools, repurposed, not revered. The opposition was swift. Talk radio exploded. The American Restorationist Bloc called it cultural genocide. But in a rare show of bipartisan resolve, the bill passed. Barely. The president signed it into law in a televised address, standing not in the Rose Garden, but at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial, facing the reflecting pool where King had once dreamed aloud. That night, the last Confederate flag flew over a state capitol for the last time. In Mississippi, long the last holdout, the legislature voted to redesign its flag. The new design bore no echoes of the Confederacy. It bore a magnolia blossom, delicate, southern, inclusive, a symbol not of the past, but of renewal. The old flag was folded, boxed, placed in a museum beside shackles, battle relics, and 1,000 stories of pain, but not forgotten, because forgetting, the nation had learned, was the original sin. The Confederacy had begun as a rebellion. It had died on battlefields, but lived in memory. Now, at last, the memory had been placed into context, not erased, but confronted. And with that, the final banner of the lost cause was lowered, not by conquest, but by understanding. But memory, once awakened, does not sleep again. And history, once reshaped, demands a new question. What now becomes of the Union it tried so long to destroy? The answer, perhaps, lies in what we choose to build next. Once the last flag has fallen, it is the year 2030, and for the first time in generations, the South feels quiet, not in the absence of conflict, but in the presence of reflection. The monuments have fallen. The flags have been folded. The streets once named for Confederate generals have been rechristened in honor of abolitionists, poets, labor leaders, and those who bled for justice. But silence, as America knows too well, is never a guarantee of peace. This chapter, centuries in the making, did not end in the fire of war, nor in the ink of law alone. It ended in the minds of a people who finally asked themselves what it meant to remember and what it meant to lie. What remained of the Confederacy by 2030 was no longer an army or a cause. It was something deeper, something harder to excise, an idea. The idea that a nation can be built upon injustice and still call itself free. The idea that nostalgia can replace accountability. The idea that symbols matter more than lives. Those ideas lingered long after the last statue was torn down. In the small towns of Alabama, where the land still smells like gunpowder after the rain, there are those who still whisper about the Old South. They still pass down stories of Lee and Jackson, no longer as generals, but as folk heroes, ghosts of a simpler time, as they call it, when men were men and everybody knew their place. Their children listen, some believe, some grow up and leave. But the myth, though wounded, still walks among them. And yet, in those same towns, new institutions are rising. In Montgomery, a memorial now stands not to soldiers, but to the enslaved, a silent field of stone markers, each engraved with the name of a person sold, beaten, or lynched under a flag once revered. Tourists walk the grounds in hushed reverence. Schoolchildren write essays after visiting. Some weep, some do not understand. But they see it, they cannot deny it. Across the South, reconciliation centers have opened. They are funded not just by governments, but by families, some of whose names once adorned slave ledgers. The descendants of Confederate leaders now sit across from the descendants of the enslaved. Not in courtrooms, but in classrooms. They study together, they argue, they remember. The movement is imperfect. At times, performative. Often resisted. But it is happening. In Washington, the National Memory Commission releases its final report. It does not call for punishment, nor reparations, nor revenge. It calls for knowledge. It publishes the names of every slaveholder who served in federal office, every company that profited from the sale of human beings, every law passed to protect white supremacy under the veil of civility. It names the sins and those who committed them. It is not vengeance. It is truth. Some reject it. Cable pundits decry it as a shame spiral. Others call it necessary medicine. The report becomes required reading in universities. A National Day of Remembrance is established. April 9th, the day Lee surrendered at Appomattox, not to celebrate Union victory, but to reflect on what was nearly lost. And still, the work continues. In Mississippi, a new monument rises, not made of bronze or marble, but of glass. It lists no names, it shows no faces. Instead, etched into its surface are words, real words, taken from plantation records, emancipation petitions, lynching reports, civil rights court cases, and jailhouse transcripts. Words like, I am owned. I ran because he beat my son. Let him vote. He fought for this country. I did not resist. The monument is transparent. It reflects whoever stands before it. It forces the viewer to see themselves in the history, whether as oppressor, survivor, or witness. Because that, finally, is what the struggle over the Confederacy was always about. Not just whose statue stands, but whose face we see in the mirror. We are a nation of contradictions, built on liberty, forged in slavery, victorious in war, but hesitant in peace, eager to celebrate, afraid to confess. And yet, despite all of it, we move forward. We have learned, at great cost, that erasing the Confederacy from public squares is easier than erasing it from the American psyche, that dismantling monuments does not dismantle myth, that memory must be rebuilt, like a ruined city, brick by brick, truth by truth. The South has not forgotten, but it has begun to remember differently. So has the North, so has the West, so has America. The legacy of the Confederacy no longer floats unchallenged in schoolyards or city halls. It is now surrounded by fact, by context, by pain, and by hope. The lost cause has been exposed as what it always was, a story crafted to bury another story. And we, at last, have exhumed that buried truth. This does not mean the work is finished. Racism has not vanished. Inequality still scars our cities and schools. There are still those who yearn for the power structures of the past, who cry heritage while waving banners of hate. But they are no longer unopposed. They are no longer unchallenged. Because in confronting what the Confederacy was, what it became, we have been forced to ask the question we feared most. What does it say about us, that we let it live so long? There is no easy answer, only resolve. Resolve to teach, to name, to build, and to heal. Because history is not just what we inherit, it's what we choose to do with it. And as the sun sets over the old battlefields, where grass grows over blood, and shadows lengthen over silent cannons, a new story begins, not of rebellion or denial, but of reckoning. A republic, still imperfect, but finally, perhaps, facing the truth. What do you think would have happened if this alternate world became reality? Would it have made our world better or worse? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this journey fascinating, don't forget to like and share the video.